The story today is Wandering in the Wilderness. Our story of bravery today follows Joshua and the Israelite people. Joshua had been chosen as a new leader, but when he was much younger, the first leader, Moses, sent him on a mission. He called one man from each of the 12 tribes to go out as spies into Canaan. Joshua was one of the 12 men that were appointed to bring news of the land and its people. 10 children stand and act afraid. Joshua and Caleb remained seated. 10 of the spies reported that it was impossible to enter Canaan because the people who lived there were much bigger and stronger than the children of Israel. The 10 children walked off stage giving a thumbs down. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, believed that God would protect them and that he would keep his promises. Joshua and Caleb smiled and gave a thumbs up and walked off the opposite side of the stage. Sadly, the children of Israel did not believe in Joshua and Caleb. They were too afraid, so they had to wander for 40 more years in the wilderness. During this time, they learned to turn to God every day for their food and water until they trusted Him enough to enter the promised land. It took courage for Joshua and Caleb to speak up. When the other spies were spread about, they were brave. They decided to follow God without turning back in fear. That's one of the reasons Joshua was chosen as a leader. His faith in God's protection would be the greatest weapon in the battle to come. When we decide to follow God, He'll help us battle any fears and stand strong in His presence.
By the time they were ready to cross the Jordan River and enter the Promised Land, the children of Israel were trusting God with every step. In fact, they walked right into the Jordan River knowing that God would part the waters. And sure enough, God did.
The Bible tells us that the water rose up on either side miles apart during the flood season. They walked across the dry land, but instead of going to Canaan right away, God asked His people to stop and build an altar. Just as before, 12 men from the 12 tribes were chosen to represent their tribes. This time, instead of being spies, they were each asked to pick up a stone from the river and place them in the middle of the camp.
God wanted the people and all generations that came after to remember just how mighty He was. This altar was a memorial to help them remember what He had done, to save them, and how His presence would always be with them in the future.
Joshua gives the reason for this altar in chapter 4, verses 21 through 24. When your children ask their fathers in times to come, "What do these stones mean?" Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which He dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth will know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever.
There are altars in our lives too. It is important for us to remember what God has done to take care of us in the past. When we talk about these memories of how God has been with us, we can be more confident of God's presence in the future.
Our story doesn't stop at the altar. The Israelites' first big battle in Canaan was coming. But the walls of Jericho were very tall and very strong. Joshua knew that his people needed God's help. He encouraged them to turn to God and demonstrate their trust in Him. Before the battle ever began, the Israelite people rededicated themselves to the Lord. Then they celebrated the Passover, which is a celebration of how God delivered them from slavery in Egypt. They ate food that came from the land. They remembered what God had done and put their trust fully in Him. When Joshua was nearing Jericho, a mighty man with a sword drawn stood in front of him.
Are you for us or for our enemies?
Neither, the man replied, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence. The man told him to take off his shoes because he stood on holy ground. God was in Joshua's presence and he was ready to listen. The commander of the Lord's army gave Joshua encouragement. He ensured that God would be with them in battle and that Israelites would have the victory. God gave Joshua and his people some very strange instructions for the battle. But there was a big difference between the first time the Israelites came to the land of Canaan and now. When Moses sent out spies 40 whole years before, all but Joshua and Caleb were filled with fear. Now the Israelite people trusted in God. They knew that what he had done for them in Egypt. They knew what he had done for them while wandering in the wilderness. They knew what he had done for them when they crossed the Jordan River. They knew God was with them, and they knew they could be brave.
The first day, the men marched around the walls with the sound of the trumpets. The second day, the men marched around the walls with the sound of the trumpets. The third day, the men marched around the walls with the sound of the trumpets. And this went on for 6 whole days. They would march around the walls and go back to the camp without raising their voices.
God told Joshua, "March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days." The armed guard went first, then the priests with the Ark of the Covenant, and then the army was to follow. But they were not to raise their voices when they marched. But the 7th day was different. On the 7th day, Joshua commanded the army to march 7 times. Then Joshua told the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Everyone who was marching shouted as loud as they could, and the mighty city of Jericho's walls came tumbling down. The city fell, and God's people had the victory that day, but they did not have to get through the walls themselves. It was God who did the fighting for them. The bravest of warriors in Joshua's army would not have had the victory without God going before them. They would not have won this battle without trusting in God's instructions and believing in His presence.